welcome to another video in our Green Dream series. I'm ESG Clarity Deputy Editor Natasha Turner, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Richard Burrett, Chief Sustainability Officer at Earth Capital. It's great to have you with us today, Richard.
Thanks, Natasha. It's great to have the opportunity to talk.
So we caught up with Earth Capital about a year ago for a profile on the firm. What's happened since then? What have the latest developments been?
On the sustainability side, I guess a couple of things. One, we've received our Guernsey Green Fund accreditation, certification, which is, I think, a very positive step forward because our Nobel Sustainability Fund is, it is housed in Guernsey, and it's great to have that sort of stamp of approval that what we're doing meets their green certification. And I think, we've been doing a lot of things this year, but the work on TCFD has been really interesting. We're doing it for the second year now, and it's sort of getting bedded into our analysis of our businesses. And we're now moving it, obviously, towards developing a net zero strategy, but there'll be more news on that shortly.
Great, yeah, lots of net zero commitments coming out as we move closer to COP.
Indeed.
Okay, well, that's great, but changing gears a little bit then, talk me through the Equator Principles, what they are and what your involvement with their creation is.
Yeah, well, I guess that's going back to 2003, when I was Global Head of Project Finance at ABN AMRO, and my hair was much darker than it is now. I think we were having problems, particularly on the environmental and social side, with a number of the projects we were financing, and it was clear that those problems were being shared by other banks in the project finance sector. So we convened a meeting at ABN AMRO's office in London with the largest project finance banks globally, which was unusual because we didn't meet up with our competitors very often unless we were working on a transaction together. And the IFC, part of the World Bank Group, had helped to convene the meeting, which was really useful. And we had 2 days together. And the first day was really spent where each of us in turn shared details of transactions we'd worked on where there had been environmental and social problems, and we were talking through how we'd managed them. And we had a day of these presentations, and it was a fascinating but quite a sobering day. And sobering is probably the right word, because later one of the IFC senior executives said it felt like an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting where, one by one we were stepping up and effectively saying we've got a problem. Quite quickly on the second day, we agreed that we would try to work to come up with a framework that we could use collectively to level the playing field. 4 of us from 4 different banks went off to work on that, and sort of 6 to 9 months later, the Equator Principles were created, and they were, I guess, the first attempt by the finance sector to come up with a systematic way of looking at environmental and social risk, that time in the context of large infrastructure projects. And what was interesting was within a year or two, most of those banks had actually developed sustainability departments and were beginning to look at other activities across their product range. And I guess if nothing else, the Equator Principles were a real catalyst for a lot of the leading banks to start to look at the sustainability agenda.
Yeah, and it definitely seems like this is an area where there's so much scope for collaboration, and we've seen so many things since that have come out.
Yeah, that's really true. But some banks were really concerned about it, particularly the US domiciled banks, because the antitrust regulations there are quite strict, and they're painfully aware of them. And the idea of trying to create standards amongst banks, they were concerned that it might be perceived as infringing antitrust. I took a more pragmatic view, which is, well, if we're criticised for trying to improve standards, I'm quite comfortable with that. It's not like libel rigging or something else.
Okay, well, just lastly then, let's move on to a possibly slightly controversial topic of carbon offsetting, which we've seen, more stories coming out about. Do you think this has a role to play in the transition to net zero?
It has to. I know many people struggle with the concept of offsetting, but I mean, if you look at the EU's net zero transition plan, if you look at the UK's plan, they both include the need for offsetting, because as you decarbonize an economy, and it's true when you try and decarbonize a company too, you often get to a point where there are some residual emissions that are really difficult to remove, perhaps even impossible to remove. So there you need something to offset that. So in the context of a country, it can obviously be reforestation schemes, schemes that look to create carbon sinks in more land, peatlands, etc. And at company level as well. I mean, you can look at either doing something within your company that positively sequesters carbon, or you can buy offsets, and you need to ensure that those offsets are of quality, of course. I mean, and that is critical. I mean, at Earth Capital, we've worked with the UNFCCC's Climate Neutral Now initiative, and we've, on our own footprint, our own organizational footprint, we've been buying some good quality UN sort of CDM equivalent credits to offset our organizational footprint. And I think the same will need to be done as we move towards net zero with our portfolio companies. We will first of all work through the carbon sort of mitigation hierarchy. You try to reduce your emissions as much as possible. You perhaps invest in new technologies or approaches that can drive them down further. You look at your emissions across your value chain and reduce them as far as you can. But then, if there are residual emissions, then you look to credibly offset them.
Right, so it's a part of the whole process rather than being...
It's a part of the whole process. I mean, I think the critics quite rightly say offsets should not be a get out of jail free card. You shouldn't be running around buying lots of offsets and then saying, well, I can continue to pollute. It works the other way around. You reduce your emissions first and you invest in doing that. And that may mean partnering with other people, using other people's expertise to help you do that. But that is step one. Only when you've got to a position that you cannot reduce emissions further, do you consider offsetting?
Yeah, that makes sense. Well, just finally then, we always finish off with a more fun question, which is, what is your favorite sustainable food or drink?
Now, I am flexitarian and increasingly vegetarian. So I've tried many food and drinks. Perhaps during lockdown, one thing I discovered, I saw a really good presentation at the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership by an executive of a company called Toast Ale. And Toast Ale makes fantastic beer. I'm not a shareholder, there's no conflict of interest, and all their profits go to charity. And they make their ale by replacing the barley with waste bread. So it's surplus bread. Rather than it going to waste, it goes into their beer. There's a wide range of beers. They're absolutely wonderful. And I thoroughly encourage people to go out and buy them.
Brilliant, I'll have to check that out. Well, thanks so much for joining us today, Richard. It's been great to speak with you.
Thanks, Natasha.